My name is Brian. I work out of our Murray office. A little bit about me. Um, I'm an LCSW by licensure. I went to this University of Utah, did grad school there. And my wife and I, life's not slowing down. We've got 4 kids under the age of 8. Um, and with the whole coronavirus and such going on, it's been a really intriguing sort of situation. And I would imagine the same for most, if not everybody else, in its own way, shape, or form. And most of the work I've done in a nutshell, I've worked a lot with addiction populations and mental health diagnoses co-occurring in a number of different facility settings. Done a lot of work as well with dementia, death and dying, grief and loss, anxiety, depression, trauma, stress, and kind of intermingled with all that, family and different types of relationship dynamics. So I find this stuff really fascinating, and I kind of geek out, I admit that. Um, so if you have questions, again, like Heather said, feel free to ask. You can type those in, or you can unmute the microphone if you've got a quick comment or question, and we're going to try and get this presentation done in about an hour's time, so we can all get back to life at about 1 o'clock. So communication in the workplace. I admit I feel a bit hypocritical giving this presentation because I am far from the ideal communicator and or listener. I think my wife would be the first to agree with a smile on that one. And it's really great to see a lot of people here too. We've got quite a few, so I'll do my best here. And looking at communication in the workplace, there's a few things. I'll just flip into the next slide here. There we go. Almost went too far. It's kind of important to have a definition anytime you start talking about any subject. So just to dive in, a lot of the experience I hear, and I feel like I've had as well, in trainings in the workplace is that most communication, I don't know how many of you might have seen this, how many times, but it seems to be really common, is that most communication is nonverbal. And there's some interesting pieces about that that I wanted to point out just up front, because it's not wrong. However, the context is really, really relevant. So first off, there was a rule, I don't know if prescribed is the right word, but there was a rule put out years ago, and the research started with a man by the name of Morabian, Albert, I think, Morabian. And the challenge, he had 2 studies that took a look at communication. One looked at things from a 60-40 kind of view, and that's the study where the 55-38-7 number and reference came out of, and the 3 C's. We'll dig into that here. I do want to say, though, myths, clarifications, that sort of a thing. Does anybody out there have any specific myths that they see a lot of the time in the workplace that you wouldn't mind sharing? Granted, that could stem from the workplace into home. So go ahead. Anybody have any myths or things they've seen?
Would this be an example of when you express your feelings and somebody calls you difficult?
I think so. It could be. Yeah, actually. You want to say more real quick on that?
Well, I sent an email to a coworker that said, please don't use capital letters when you're talking to me. I took the email as yelling, and I was reprimanded for saying that, and was said that I was being difficult, and that that people use capitals all the time to get a point across.
Okay. Like the yelling as it were. Some people get the email in all caps and they're like, why are they yelling at me? That kind of a thing, if I understand you right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And it's hard. It's really hard without the face, without the physical in-person communication bit. And we all use, well, most of us, I'll say it that way, I think have used those little emojis, in work messages and such. And the research on that sort of thing is actually fairly clear and emerging. The emojis actually support filling in when there can't be a physical or a physical and body language interaction going on as well. They also have their cons in that you could put anything down and people just expect, oh, well, that was innocent. It doesn't do it full justice. However, that's something I think I've heard fairly often, in fact, in many therapy settings. How do I write an email in the workplace without being judged? What's too much? What's too little? And that kind of a thing. So, as a myth, I think that wouldn't be far off the mark. Any others? Thank you. Okay. Some other common myths, just to put them out there: women and men, gender differences, um, culture. Some I hear that a lot of the time. Some cultures, some genders are better at communication than others. And it's not necessarily that those things are always true. There's truth to those things, and that's where I'd like to take a bit of a look into things and clarifying communication and that kind of, and the aspects and shapes and forms it takes. Um, and again, if anybody's got comments, feel free to make them. You're just fine. I'm looking at that 5538.7 number on the screen. Here's what it means. In general, over 80% of communication is said to be nonverbal. The belief is that 55% of communication is body language, 38% is tone, and 7% is the words spoken. That said, that would total, if you add that up, to well over the 80%. I think that's fascinating because if we look down at kinesics, I can never say it right, paralinguistics and proxemics and haptics, we give some brief definitions out there and we'll dig into this. Kinesics is the science of body language. Paralinguistics is the science of tone of voice, just fancy ways of saying the same thing. Proxemics is space and distance, maybe waiting 3 seconds after somebody says something to give you a response, and how far apart you're sitting. Not that coronavirus has limited us on that to that 6 feet sort of thing, and you see that a lot. People speaking up and so on as well. And haptics is touch. So those are the 4 general areas in communication that we're looking at and oftentimes unconscious of, yet engage in readily. Gender, just to put it out there, and I'll actually read a little bit from a source here. The key things being this, and I'll just say quote for a moment. Women and men, of course, tend to use nonverbal behavior as different. It's what they're boiling it down to. Women tend to be more expressive when communicating. They use more facial expressions and gestures than men do. Women also smile more often than men. Women smile sometimes so often, according to the research, that it can be hard to know when the smile has a meaning of happiness. The situation deserves a smile, that is, or the smile means embarrassed, sad, angry, forgetful, and so on. Men, however, tend to smile only when they are happy or have something funny to contribute. Contrary to women, men's smile is usually congruent with their feeling of happiness. This is fascinating, I think, as well. And I'll own up to this being male, if I can do that safely. Because men do not smile as often as women and are not as expressive in their gestures and facial expressions, some view men as emotionless or label them as cold and uncaring. Guilty as charged. I've done this before. Women, however, who do not smile and look directly at the speaker may be viewed as upset, mad, unsupportive, or even snobbish. They finish the study and the research saying men who smile a lot, more than when they are happy, and stare at the speaker may be perceived as suspicious on how they have learned gender appropriate nonverbal behaviors. Anybody ever had a gender incident in the workplace with communication and it kind of took whatever route? Some yeah, some no. Okay. It's a huge area of myths that I think merits a lot of clarification. And we'll get into that in a little bit here as far as human development, brain development, even puberty to plug that in there because it does factor in. Any thoughts so far? Questions on that much? Let's see, I'm gonna look at the chat here because I can. And I like that there's a lot of incongruence being listed too. People say one thing, do another, and that's where we're gonna get into kind of kinesics, paralinguistics, proxemics, and haptics. Culture, I think, is another huge one. And I wanted to put specifically out there on this. In our culture, Western society, it's really common in the workplace to head in, even without the employer telling us what they may be, but with expectations is the big word. We go in for interviews and so on. Like the examples are almost countless, frankly. And I know I've gone into an interview before and thought, yeah, I expect this, that, and the other, and it was a one-question interview, and it totally threw me for a loop. So here's some thoughts and so forth on getting into things that we're looking at here. Gender, culture in the workplace, Western society, and so forth. And I'll just jump over the next slide here, in fact. It does matter what we say and how we say it. We're going to look at the brain and how it works. I'm going to draw on the screen for that here. Just want to make sure I've got the right place. I do want to go back to that 55-38-7 real quick and say this. I'm just going to go back to the slide, in fact, as well. When there are inconsistencies between attitudes communicated verbally and posturally, the postural component should dominate in determining the total attitude that is inferred. Or in short, typically actions are going to speak louder than words. I don't think that's necessarily news. However, there's some brain functionality to be aware of behind that that often doesn't make sense, that people are not conscious about. The 3 C's to take a look at and keep in mind, context that we're building. First C is context. The environment or the situation that's occurring, which people are. Clusters, this is a big piece of it. That is looking for nonverbal communication in clusters over one observed behavior. So not just focusing in on one behavior, but taking a look at a whole bunch of them as they've occurred in a cluster.
Do you have a slide for that?
For the 3 C's, you mean?
Uh-huh.
I don't right now.
Okay.
However, I can add one before we send this out if that works. You're right, that is a bit to take in. I'm going to take a note here. Thank you, I do appreciate that. That's great insight. So the clusters could be arms crossed and teeth chattering and shoulders raised. If a person just looked at the arms crossed, A person looks like they're closed off, maybe not very engaged, frankly. If their teeth are also chattering and their shoulders are up, they're probably cold. Easy miscommunication that anybody could mistakenly label. Happens all the time. The third C being congruent, which is, do the spoken words match the tone and body language? Say that one again. Do the spoken words match the tone and the body language? So if somebody fell down and they said they're okay, but they're trembling and shaking and grimacing, probably not very believable. In the workplace, if somebody says, oh, I didn't know that, I didn't mean to, and they're trembling, interesting inferences that we could take a look at. Any other thoughts or questions on those C's and this much so far? And if you'd want to unmute the microphone, I think that'd be easier. So taking a look then at emotions, and emotional intelligence is a big role in this. I've drawn this on presentations before. I think it's fairly invaluable. So I'm going to switch screens and just draw here on the white pad. Here we go. Perfect. I'm going to try and draw a brain here to give some context. I think understanding what goes on in the brain with communication is a big deal because there's a lot of subconscious pieces to it. So I'm going to try and draw a brain here. Here we go. I hope this is easy enough to see. There we go. So we've got a side view of a brain here, more or less. Got the cerebellum in the back and a brain stem, and there's two parts that we're going to look at here. First one is going to be right here. We're going to have the second part be right here. In short, and I'll label these, down here is the first place we're going to look. We call this the emotional brain for conversation and discussion's sake. And then up here, we're going to call this the rational brain. I'll do this too. Also called the executive brain, and then down here, go. The primitive brain. So a few key pieces about both parts of the brain. One, they communicate indirectly, kind of like this, to give you an idea, indirectly. Physically, they communicate indirectly through a number of brain mechanisms. And when these two brains are functioning and communicating together, we would say that a person is being him or herself. Draw that over here. Me or us, and I'll even say a business, be all-inclusive. And we'll do this. There we go. And then over here, we'll go right there next. Two things to be aware of with the emotional brain. First off, it is the first stop in the brain information goes every single time. Doesn't matter age, gender, culture, doesn't matter. That's the first place information goes every single time it hits the brain. We call it the emotional brain, the primitive brain. Some call it the reptilian brain, the midbrain. It's got a whole bunch of different names. I'll refer to it as well as survival mode here in a bit. The second piece on that note to this part of the brain is this. This is where that fight, flight, or freeze mechanism that a lot of us hear of or maybe have heard of in school or some other place lives, in that emotional part of the brain. I don't think coincidentally that nature did that, because anytime the brain, the emotional brain, has the information incoming and there's a threat, this could be a threat to my ego, a threat to my feeling respected, a threat to my or our independence, mobility, being right and wrong, all those sorts of things. Seeing somebody else, their body language, if they give me kind of that, that face, stuff like that. All that information comes in here. And when that happens, that part of the brain interprets whether that's threatening or not. We don't even consciously realize it. It's just a subconscious process that we do. When that happens, that information is interpreted, that is. If there's a legitimate threat, specifically to me, myself, my identity, my ego, feeling respected again, the things we just mentioned, or if there's a threat to my sense of well-being and health, people getting, by the doctor diagnosed, hey, you've got some terminal cancer. Ooh, it's a heavy communication. It could be a life or death situation as well. It's threatening. I'm being chased through the woods by a bear. There's an active shooter situation. I'm about to sit down with management and I have no idea what's going on. Stuff like that. Fight, flight, or freeze mode gets turned on. That is to say, the brain starts to react subconsciously without me choosing to whatever information is incoming that is perceived as a threat. So we'll come back to that in a sec, but the rational executive brain, two things about that part of the brain too. One is it is in charge of organizing, planning, scheduling, prioritizing, those sorts of things. And in that part of the brain, those abilities, part two of what's relevant there, become available for any individual to use when they're about age 20, fully available, that is. So in early to mid 20s, that part of the brain is actually starting to develop and come more and more online up until about age 24. That is to say, essentially, that before I hit my early to mid 20s, that part of the brain is unavailable, inaccessible, non-functional, meaning that kids and teens, before that brain becomes available in early to mid 20s, are able to act from their emotional brain specifically. And they can mimic or copy what they see grown-ups doing from their rational brain. They cannot independently use their own rational or access their own rational logical ability. Brain's not ready for that yet. Kind of a big deal. Or in essence, kids and teens can only react to just about everything because of how the brain is wired. So having said that, in the workplace, because this happens, when there's a threatening message communicated, people might be being laid off. Maybe there's a firing going on. Maybe there's management switching. Maybe somebody communicates something to me and I don't appreciate the way they said it. Nobody knows necessarily before they get into a novel situation how their reaction might be. When that fight, flight, or freeze turns on, to tie it all together here, the emotional brain very literally hijacks a person's ability to access rational brain. They physically cannot go there for a period of time, and a person is left subconsciously and consciously to the mercy of whatever the subconscious does in terms of reacting. So I just said a lot. Does that make sense? Anybody want to unmute and just let me know if that makes sense, or you've got questions?
I think it's absolutely beautiful, and it kind of reminds me of the work of Bessel van der Kolk. I mean, if you can
Yes.
understand this for self and others, I love it.
Right, and that's actually a really good book just for general education and information. I think it's called The Body Keeps the Score. Wonderful book on how the brain works and traumas and so on. So to add more to this drawing here, when that emotional brain takes over because of whatever communicated threat I perceived subconsciously, another individual inside of a person's physical body or inside of an organization takes over. And we call that sometimes hijacked or ill version, meaning fight, flight, or freeze, emotional brain is running the show. When that happens on a larger scale, we often get into something we call the herd mentality, where everybody has all kinds of thinking errors and irrational, illogical thoughts going on. That sort of a thing is what we're talking about. And it's usually kind of hard to snap out of that because everybody is chasing subconsciously some sort of irrational experience that was put into their brain by a threat. It's usually past or future thinking. What if this? What if that? What if the other? I should have this, I should have that, I should have the other before I sent the email, before I talked to my boss, and so on and so forth. Point being, if we can learn how to reconnect communication between the rational and executive brains, that puts us back right here, being ourselves individually, as a team, as a company, as a corporation, whatever level you name it. And that's where we typically want to be when it comes to being in the workplace, functionality, and stuff like that, rather than over here. So, with that in mind, there's one thing I would put out there because trauma from workplace communication is totally a thing. And I don't think it's covered a lot. So here we go. What happens in the brain is this. We don't consciously wake up to do this. There we go. Something triggers us. There's a threat that comes into the brain, and the brain reacts. We don't consciously choose it again. It just happens because that's how we're wired. So we fight, flight, or freeze, maybe fight and argue with a colleague, a boss, with myself. I run to the bathroom and like scream it out, whatever it may be. And other people would run away from the threat, flee in some way, shape, or form. I know sometimes people have used FMLA or short-term disability, and this is not a judgment at all because nothing else makes sense to support them in coping with communications they're getting. It's real stuff. What that ultimately leads to, though, as there's something that triggers or sets me off as a threat, is I have an experience, a survival experience, based on what threatened me. What happens in the brain is this. This is where I geek out, so I apologize in advance. When the brain gets triggered, fight, flight, or freeze again takes over up here. I cannot access my rational brain, period, for a time at least. Then what happens in the brain is I react, I fight, flight, or freeze on the spot, and the brain subconsciously says, oh, that worked. Those reactions, we made it through that threatening, tense experience. Cool. Next time something stressful like that comes up in a similar communication or what have you, let's do those things again because they work. We're alive, we survived. The problem is those reactions aren't logical. Here's the kicker. This is all hardwired, physically hardwired inside of the brain. It is part of who we physically are. So when that's all hardwired in the brain, and the brain has another threatening communication come through, it often chases the same survival experience subconsciously over and over and over again, even though logically it wouldn't make sense and it's not necessarily the most healthy reaction or response to the threatening communication. And just like a muscle, the more that gets, that brain pathway that I'm drawing here gets worked out in the brain, the more and more go-to it becomes until the brain learns to basically chase that survival reaction experience over and over again instead of stopping, pausing, and taking some time and space to be rational and to think through it. And so a lot of the time, people will find themselves in that downward spiral with communications because that's how the brains experience their workplace. And I would say it, according to the research as well, happens a lot more than most people are willing to say. Does that make sense so far? Any comments before we transition over? Okay. Okay. Here's the thing here. We're looking at tones. There's a few questions as well. Generational gaps and differences. Let's get into some of this. How do we get across without being annoying? Things like that. Great questions. Let's take a look. And I might just take it off this first. Here we go. Okay, here we go. So long and short would be, if we're taking a look at communication in the workplace, generation gaps, there is no really one way to bridge them. It ultimately comes down to learning the other generation's communication approaches and tactics and techniques, if you will, learning another generation's language. And that's hard for quite a few, myself included. There's a few things, though, to bridge parts of those, and I would like to show a couple of videos real quick, or at least one video quick here. Let's go back. The thing being on empathy. Let's see here. Oh, it's not going to let me do it. That's rough. Here we go. So I'd like to share this video clip and then come back to this and even just have a discussion, if that's okay. So here we go.
Are they supposed to be watching a video right now?
Oh, did it not go through on the share?
No, your screen isn't shared anymore. So right now it's just showing your face.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me try that again. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone else popped up. We're all on there, so we can't see it.
No, I appreciate that. Here we go. Let's try this again. You ready?
Yeah, let's see if it works.
Okay.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, and climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." I had a, yeah. And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Are those available to download?
They are free on YouTube, and I've got the links right later on here, right there.
So your screen isn't shared, so you have to share your screen again. But yeah, the links, if they're not on the presentation, which it sounds like they are, I'll be sending out this recording later, as well as Brian's presentation in PDF. So you'll be able to just go on and click those links and pull it up.
Right here, if you want as well, yeah. There's a two other links I've got there as well. However, I admit, I thought long and hard. I asked my wife about this. I've collaborated with others, because in an hour, I don't think there's any real way to cover every aspect of communication. It's just, you can't do it. I think, and I feel strongly that, and I'd be willing to defend it, or however it may needs to be said. I strongly think that empathy and sympathy are huge parts of the workplace communication culture that are often overlooked because we have to chase some kind of a dollar bill. And a lot of the research from the psychological view would agree with parts of that. Granted, there's more to it, not to ignore factors. And sympathy and empathy, what I mean by those to define is, sympathy is recognizing feelings and then telling somebody or myself what I'm supposed to feel instead. Sympathy. For example, if somebody got pushed out of line, in the lunchroom on accident, excuse me, rather than, oh, I'm so sorry, get up, you can do this, just get back at the end of the line. No problem, you're not bleeding. Empathy in change would look something like this. Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh my gosh. We often call it even dramatic a little bit. Are you okay? That looked like it wasn't fun. Can I help you? And we open up exploring the emotional experience with somebody, whether or not we've been there before, as a key part of it. I don't know. Does that make sense? I'm trying to say a lot in very few words. Any thoughts on that?
I believe that you could also say empathy equals truth, and sympathy often is our use of cognitive dissonance, so we don't have to deal with the real issue.
Right. Absolutely. Like the goat kind of in the video. You want a sandwich? Right. It's a true thing. And I wanted to touch on this specific part of sympathy and empathy and say how well in the workplace, not that we don't do this to other people, how well do we empathize with ourselves? Like speak empathy, if it were a language, to me, myself personally. I think oftentimes it's easier to hide behind or to not comment on something because, oh, I don't know how to say it the right way, which is fine. I think too often, though, because of discomfort, having that vulnerability, being willing to explore it in a safe way is an experience we often shortchange ourselves with, whether it's because of culture, gender, trauma, and I'm not saying those are bad excuses, simply working through them rather than running or fighting or freezing when they come up again and again. And with that, there's another little clip on shame and guilt that I'd want to show to bring this more full circle. Let's see. Stop there and go there real quick. Here we go. Share that as well. Perfect.
The thing to understand about shame is it's not guilt. Shame is a focus on self. Guilt is a focus on behavior. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad. How many of you, if you did something that was hurtful to me, would be willing to say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake? How many of you would be willing to say that? Guilt. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Shame. I'm sorry, I am a mistake. There is a huge difference between shame and guilt. And here's what you need to know. Shame is highly, highly correlated with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, eating disorders. And here's what you even need to know more. Guilt, inversely correlated with those things. The ability to hold something we've done or failed to do up against who we want to be is incredibly adaptive. It's uncomfortable, but it's adaptive. If you put shame in a petri dish, it needs 3 things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. The 2 most powerful words when we're in struggle: me too. And so I'll leave you with this thought. If we're going to find our way back to each other, vulnerability is going to be that path. And I know it's seductive to stand outside the arena because I think I did it my whole life and think to myself, I'm going to go in there and kick some ass when I'm bulletproof and when I'm perfect. And that is seductive. But the truth is, that never happens. And even if you got as perfect as you could and as bulletproof as you could possibly muster, when you got in there, that's not what we want to see. We want you to go in. We want to be with you and across from you. And we just want for ourselves and for the people we care about and the people we work with to dare greatly. So thank y'all very much. I really appreciate it.
So good food for thought there from Dr. Brene Brown. It's part of a bigger TED Talk she's given in the past. Excuse me. Anybody want to plug a thought in so far on that or make a comment? Feel free.
Will that link or will that be in the presentation that you send out?
Yes, absolutely. And all these video clips are free. You can access them online from anywhere that there's internet or a connection to the internet. And so yeah, feel free to take a look at those things. Another thing, just going back to the slides here briefly, and to share that again. I admit I'm not totally used to sharing back and forth like this all the time. Show you. If we take a look, and I'm going to jump right here. This is, I think, one of the best ways I have been able to connect with people and talking about communication in the workplace and to really break it down into a language. And this, of course, will be included in the slides. And I can even include a handout on this if that would be helpful. With text on the handout that is explaining more about the fine-tuned parts of this, the logistics. In sum, you all see my mouse, by the way? No, yes?
You can see it.
Yeah, we can.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. If we take a look at any individual or an organization or a group within an organization and communication, at the heart of it, there's me and or us. And we all have feelings and experiences. Feelings lead to experiences. Experiences lead to feelings, obviously. And they all develop into, over time, tastes and preferences on many different levels, obviously. This we call being human. The humanness of being part of a company, of being myself, of being in a relationship with the group I'm in, based on interactions we've had, and so on and so forth. Communication styles having been learned from past experiences, upbringings, how I was raised, my own values, culture, so on and so forth. There's so much that goes into it that's often not looked at. When a person has feelings, then they have experiences, they lead to tastes and preferences. An example, how many of us have been very excited to go see a movie at the movie theater because they did a slam dunk job advertising the trailer and the movie looks fantastic, only to walk out of the theater and say, well, that stunk. My expectations weren't met. I'm never going to go see that franchise ever again. Some have, some haven't, sure. That's what we're talking about right here, that kind of a thing. We often head into things with feelings and expectations that shape our experiences and develop tastes and preferences. In the workplace, as this happens to us in and outside of work, following this arrow up, tastes and preferences lead to identified values. And this is key in communication in the workplace or in any place, even with oneself. If we have a culture of communication that's healthy, everybody knows what the company's values are, they're named, they're defined, and how to meet those is specifically outlined. We often call those job descriptions. Your job description, these are your boundaries at work. These are the people you could reach out to or the resources to branch out to for communication or to get feedback and so on and so forth. This is where it gets a little sticky, I think. How many people might we say realistically know consistently our identified values or have refreshers and know how to stand up for those values? What are the expectations? What are my job descriptions over time and across space? What are others as well? Because that enables that healthy back and forth between departments, employees, management, different levels of management, and so on. If we're all on the same page with identified values and we know what is expected of us, communication becomes a lot easier. If we don't, that's where empathy jumps in and I explore feelings with others so that we can process the experiences and create the meaning that would mesh with the values we work towards together. So that's the initial piece. As we take a look at boundaries, following the arrow down, this is where, if I know my job expectations, those boundaries up here, and then I implement and make an effort to do that by communicating and so on, I hold myself accountable. I stand for my values, and the values of the company. And a person can be, they consider themselves accountable, and the business as well. That then leads to people learning what they can expect from me or from an organization, or they can hold us responsible based on the identity we have shown through our actions because we're living standing up for our values. Excuse me. We call that the identity triad. If we have these in place and we're reminding ourselves consistently and being aware as we talk with each other, and more than ever, body language, those nonverbal things, then we can have a healthy culture of communication in any setting. When that falls out of play, again, that empathy, being willing to explore that and feel with somebody else to figure out, how do I say this? What's the appropriate body language, and so on. Does that all make sense? How are we doing?
So the first one is, how do you know if a message is getting across if there's not much feedback without being annoyed?
How do you know if the question is being heard or answered and getting across without being annoying? Typically, time and space and being a squeaky wheel is what the science would back it up and say, and not approaching it from again, the empathy piece. From hey, where are you? I haven't heard this. Come on, what's going on? But really, hey, I really wanted to follow up because I value this, important to me. I would appreciate any feedback you might have. And I think that's a general answer, but if you want more in depth, let's do that. Let me know. That's what the science would.
Okay, so the next one is, I have a hard time with our younger generation when I am talked down to or treated like I don't know anything. Sometimes we older people have to do something to offer. Maybe it's a tone, verbiage, body language. It's still frustrating.
Yeah, okay. I definitely don't have all the answers on this one. What I have read and seen and encouraged with many who have sought support on communication at work and therapy is, if it's healthy body language that the person you're talking to is giving, mimic them. Just mimic them. Match their tone, match their body language. Essentially, without verbally saying it, kind of call them out on what they're doing. If not, boundaries, quite frankly. This is not something I understand. I wasn't brought up this way. I would value if you could teach me this, and if they decide not to, it's no longer on you. I don't know if I'm answering that as well as you'd like. However, that's what I would know off the top of the research, just answering the question.
Okay, the next one says, how do you work with someone that says one thing and acts another?
Sometimes you don't. Is, I think, the honest truth. I think that takes a high degree of vulnerability and empathy to say, hey, look, in a safe setting. And if that safe setting is an email or seeking supervision, something like that, maybe for guidance towards that. I mean, there's a few really good books actually that I would refer. I'm going to share the screen again just quick because they're listed there. Right here. There's a book called Sitting in the Fire by Arnold Mindell. It's really good on that topic specifically. There's also a book called Crucial Conversations. It's really good for those sorts of topics. I would encourage as well anything you might find by Michael Argyle is absolutely wonderful. The same as with Paul Ekman. He's the guy, the psychologist, who was largely behind the show, I think it's called Lie to Me, the series, where they took a lot about body language, communication, and really focused in on what those things mean and how to develop awareness of them. And on that note, I think above all, to speak to all those questions so far, I think the key being empathic awareness. How aware am I of what I am broadcasting, and how aware am I of what others are broadcasting? Taking that awareness and consciously choosing, not just reacting to what I might get or what I might want to say.
So it says, is confabulation or false memory a symptom of being stuck in emotional brain?
Great question. I think so, frankly, not consciously a choice, in that the brain, when it goes into that emotional defense, fight, flight, or freeze mode, the brain is actually working phenomenally well at protecting and defending what's perceived as threatened inside: identity, health and well-being, life or death. And I don't think it unfair to say, oftentimes in the workplace, some communications are very literally interpreted in the brain as a life or death threat, even though they're not intended that way. Hey, we got to lay you off. I get it's not me. However, I got a family and insurance and rent or a mortgage, whatever. That's kind of a life or death heaviness to it. So it's actually the brain responding extraordinarily well, reacting extraordinarily well to a threat. And one of the best ways to work through that, and I love this, I'm not sure how many books say it this way, but the summary is this: letting go, emotionally speaking, does not mean to push it down, to run away from it, to freeze from it, although that's our reaction. Letting go, emotionally speaking, means having the feelings, the thoughts, naming them, exploring them, working through them the best I can, and or with support, so that those emotions can get the closure they need to quiet down and go back to home inside of me. Yeah.
Okay, and then the next one says, can there be a lot of empathy? Where does it lead to?
Great question. Yes, there can be a lot of empathy, and it may seem like it's too heavy a lot of the time, because as people, we're wired to focus on the negative. It's a survival tactic, and that's just the way our brains are wired. Pick anybody. Regardless of age, empathy leads to long-term motivation and commitment. Fear leads to the short-term motivation and commitment that doesn't stick. So what it really comes down to, I think, is by practicing empathy towards myself and towards others, even when it's hard and I don't know how to relate, I'm willing to explore what's going on and take a look at options and how to safely maybe interact with so-and-so, or if it is safe to interact at all. The more I practice the empathy, the more I develop love towards myself, towards others, and that in turn fosters the motivation, the creativity, the understanding, the innovation that companies value. And it gives me the words I need to communicate that in any means it may be: email, fax, communicate, or verbal, body language. Because again, maybe going back to the book that was referenced earlier, The Body Keeps the Score, people can smell authenticity from a mile away. If you're not going to be authentic, err on the side of being empathic, loving towards yourself, and finding the information you need. If you don't understand, go get it. That'll save so much heartbreak. And frankly, with that, I would say 9 times out of 10 in the workplace, miscommunication is the culprit 9 times out of 10. Or misinterpretations, if we can put it that way.
Well, that's all the questions we have. So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Brian, for presenting. It was awesome. And